Welcome to Hacking Business Technology. I'm Mark Kawasaki, and I'm here with Matt Hooper. How you doing, Matt?
I'm great, Mark. How are you?
Good, good. We're missing Farah and Baron today. They couldn't be here, so we're going to have plenty of questions for our guest. Our guest today is Peter Kretzman. How you doing, Peter?
Doing great.
Great. Thanks for being with us. So this podcast, we talk about technology-enabled business. Hacking business technology for us means a whole lot of things. But Peter, you're in the CIO, CTO space. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing there.
Yeah, not to give too long a thing, but going way back, after the log cabin I was born in, very early start in IT, started out as a developer, was a developer actually for many years, and still do a lot of development kind of on the side, sort of as a hobby, and I'm always aware that it is just a hobby in a lot of ways, but over the years, I've developed in probably 15 different languages, all up and across the spectrum. Worked as obviously moving up then in management. Worked as a manager, a supervisor, a project manager for a long time, and then went into basically an executive mode. And so for the last 15 years or so, I've been a CIO, CTO, and now principally a kind of a C-level consultant, working with organizations around my home area of Seattle, Puget Sound area, coaching teams towards excellence in the IT space.
Nice.
Very nice.
And I'm a blogger. I'm a blogger too. So
yeah,
kind of an opinionated son of a gun, and read my opinions online. So
I'm definitely a fan of your blog, Peter. I think one of the things I like about it is you use a lot of personal anecdotes, and that's important. I think it comes through really well. So congrats on that.
Yeah, that's actually the whole bent of it. I saw a lot when I started out, and there wasn't a lot of personal stuff in there, and I wanted it to be, I've experienced certain things, and here's the description and what I took away from it.
Yeah, it's great.
So, the question I got for you is, I was going to ask you a different question, but since you mentioned this, you called yourself a developer, and but then you moved into the management track. Do you see a difference in today's developers between a coder and, say, a programmatic solution developer?
Not quite sure I'm following. There are a lot of technologies out there today, obviously. So what's a coder can be interpreted by a bunch of different people in a bunch of different ways. So I've heard people call HTML coders to be coders, and I don't consider that programmatic in the same sense by and large. But the lines get very blurry. You get into certain technologies like XSLT, and you're going to have programmatic thinking that needs to take place more than simply related to formatting and the like. So as a developer, I'm just always aware of the growth of technologies and the fact that people exercise them in a lot of different ways and get different perspectives. Other than that, the sort of the burgeoning of technologies, I don't think there's been fundamental changes in people's outlook. We've always had a spectrum of different kind of attitudes and personalities in the IT space. I write a lot about that on my blog. So
yeah.
Well, perhaps it's just a difference in how much designing programmers should be doing, and whether that's more of a skill that they need today than they did before.
Yeah, designing in terms of like software architectures and the like.
Sure. How creative should they be when they're coding?
Yeah, I think that there's an ability to leverage, and there's almost a requirement to leverage things now in terms of prior art and frameworks and the like, just in the sense of being able to be productive and to build on what others have done before you. You can't always reinvent the wheel, and so there's certainly that requirement. So maybe there's a little bit less of start things from scratch than there was before. But I still see people doing an awful lot of start things from scratch and not leveraging those, and that's part of what I kind of help clients with.
Hacking just seems to be such this big thing, right? People want a hacker mentality, get it done fast, be out there. But I still think that there's a lot of opportunity for people who like to write software to still develop applications and develop frameworks and still develop things, as opposed to writing code and just hacking things together. I mean, What's your thoughts on it?
It's kind of a there should always, and this is nothing new in terms of what there should have been. There needs to be a sort of a mindset towards reusability and towards leveraging other things and being able to pass it on appropriately. And that's kind of what I see as going beyond the stereotype of the hacker, which is just sort of make it work no matter how ugly it may be, no matter how little it may be maintainable and the like, into making it to some degree, maintainable and flexible and stable and performant and all that. Those are the kinds of things actually where I see kind of a dividing line in types of individuals that enter programming, and there are some that are really bent on just getting it done. It doesn't really matter. They're impatient with the idea of these illities that I just talked about, and then there are others that sort of naturally gravitate to them. And I work pretty hard at trying to bring along the people that are the freewheelers into some at least awareness of the other factors that have to be considered when doing design, coding, implementation. I mean, I said I was a developer, but what I didn't mention and stress, and is kind of part of my mindset, is that I've worked across the spectrum in IT now, in particular operations, and I've had the 2x4 smacked up my head a few times as a developer, not understanding really what the operations bent needed to be, what the operations impact of certain decisions or practices happened to be. And so, again, that's kind of what I try to bring to the spectrum, is that awareness across the board of the various factors.
Would you consider yourself big on DevOps then, that sort of movement?
I actually am very big on DevOps. It's a thing. We could have a whole discussion about DevOps and what that entails. And like so many things, like Agile, in fact, it gets overused, overloaded, in some sense misused. But the whole idea of getting development and ops to work together is actually, that's kind of part of my self-definition. That's what I do. Mm-hmm. And I've done it way before anybody coined the term of DevOps.
I've talked to a lot of folks in the DevOps community about this, and one of the things that's a bit of a misnomer is people think that DevOps is a free-for-all. And most of the folks who've been in it for a while, such as Gene Kim and John and all these guys who are out there really kind of pioneering the movement, they'll all tell you you can't have DevOps without some level of operational excellence. And so, right. It really requires two mentalities and two camps working in harmony. Your scouts
and people that see both sides of that. And there aren't always a lot of people that see both sides. There's people who very vividly see one side or the other and get their backs up. And that's almost the change management, the political aspect of trying to spawn a valid DevOps approach. The two individuals you mentioned, I assume you meant Gene Kim and John Allspaw. Really key folks there in some of these movements, and I've learned a lot from both of them.
Yeah, but the thing is, at the same time, if you consider yourself an organization with operational excellence and you're doing one change a day and there's groups doing 700 changes a day, how do you make that shift? That's pretty large, right?
Yeah, actually, I'm writing about that right now because, it's easy for, let's imagine the CEO on the airplane flight who reads the airline magazine, and let's imagine there's an article about this, continuous delivery mode that people are in, and Netflix does N100 or N1000 deployments a day, and Amazon and eBay, whoever. And they come back and say, oh, we need to do that. Well, there's a whole bunch of prerequisites in terms of getting the mindset, getting the tools, getting the appropriate testability of stuff, getting the ability to stick something into code and pull it out really quickly from production if it isn't working, and being able to gauge that. And it isn't something that you implement overnight. It's a really valid and enticing and really critical thing to do in terms of being able to try lots of things and maintain the velocity that you need.
Yeah, definitely. So what's this whole hashtag no estimates thing? What is that about, and are you for that or against that?
Yeah, well, I'm going to give you probably here a very jaundiced view of it. I'm what I told Matt when he asked me if I wanted to do this. I said, well, I'm happy to talk about no estimates. I am, without a doubt, one of the 2 or 3 most active vocal critics of the no estimates movement as I see it. And I can go on for a long time. I've been participating probably for about a year in that hashtag. Why do I spend the time and energy? It's a really frustrating and in some ways very rancorous discussion that happens there. But my belief is that this is not an idea, contrary to things like DevOps, contrary to much of Agile, contrary to things like TDD, test-driven development, that I'm a huge fan of. I see no estimates being a sort of a bad idea. I can't put it any more bluntly, less bluntly than that, in essence. What is no estimates? I will give you my personal view of it. Unfortunately, it's kind of hard to pin down the no estimates advocates in a lot of ways about what it actually is. They will tell you we're just exploring alternatives to estimates. But they kind of start out with estimates, declaring that estimates are terrible things. They're awful. They lead to management abuse in terms of, they get forged as commitments. It's very common for the no estimates advocates to post Dilberts, sometimes 6 times a day, to the same Dilbert strip by the same individual. It's a really strong thing that, kind of viewing management as the evil entity pushing for these estimates, where developers just want to produce, what they produce and produce high value and focus on the next thing to do and then do that and develop and deliver frequently. So their view essentially is that you can take most things and rather than estimate them up front, define them up front really in much a way at all, you would go and you would start work on the most high value thing, and you would finish that and you would deploy it, and you would keep going in that mode, slicing the user stories into small doable chunks that you can then deploy, and that the users eventually will say, oh, okay, that's enough. We didn't need all these other things that we thought we needed when we went into it. And we've all seen that happen, right? Where users didn't really know what they wanted, and they get it defined for them as they see a system evolve. And if you take the other side of the spectrum, where we define everything up front and we implement all of that, and users look at it and go, well, gee, that's not working the way I want or expect, and now I have 29 more things that I want you to tweak it into becoming. So there's a lot of advantage to the basic idea. That said, they go down a pretty strong generalization road of estimates are bad things. Simply don't do them. They call them a wasteful and deceptive practice. They compare them to heroin, like a heroin addict needs heroin, management needs estimates. And I think it, again, jaundiced view, I think it displays a lack of understanding perspective on how business works, in the sense of business has to be able to define when things are going to be delivered, and they have to define it for a whole number of reasons. Coordinating, common efforts surrounding just the software. It's not all about the software. It's about marketing campaigns, and it's about training, and it's about getting the contact center, if you have a contact center, ready to answer appropriate questions and the like. And so coming up with a notion of what the plan is important, and part of that it entails, when do we think the software is going to be ready to deploy? When will it actually be there? Not everything is in the world of incremental development, deployment, start from almost nothing and increase it. You've got to ship a product in many cases. And so those are a number of my objections to the no estimates perspective.
Yeah.
But isn't that the commitment to estimates? What you're bringing out as a point is it's if you look at it from a siloed perspective and keep your heads down and look at it from that perspective, then estimates don't matter, and the coders have to think about, or developers, whoever, has to think about other people they might be impacting by their estimates. But if those other people aren't committed to it as an organization, then they kind of have a point, don't they? I mean, doesn't the whole organization have to be committed to estimates and validating them and scoring and measuring the quality of those estimates and trying to improve them to be more accurate?
Yeah. So in other words, couldn't management come up with their own estimates without burdening the developers to come up with them themselves? Okay,
interesting, really interesting questions there, because yes, of course. You ever been around a development team where maybe there was a failure to deliver according to an expected timeline, and people say, well, we didn't set that timeline, we didn't provide the estimates, that was that guy over there in the corner office who said we could be ready in March. And so the idea is that estimates are just a tool, a mechanism, one of a bunch of things to evolve a meaningful, achievable, viable plan. And so, it's not this thing where you just sort of declare them and then you march to them. You'd sort of go back and forth, and you do it collaboratively, and you do it iteratively to try to figure out what makes sense of when can we deliver this so that we can get all the railroad cars lined up for delivery. And in my mind, the team it can't be imposed on the team externally. The team has to have some participation. Otherwise, deadlines and commitments are being set by people with absolutely no idea of the level of work, the depth of work, the number of complexities involved, etc.
Well, it depends if you look at the estimate as an imposition or as a true estimate. You know, if management is trying to assess how long it's going to take without imposing it, that's
right.
very different than here's a target date, you're going to meet it no matter what, right?
So let me just react to that, because you're absolutely right. I mean, and the idea is that estimates should start out the thing of saying, okay, here's A, B, C, and D, these 4 different chunks that we might work on. You know, which ones are big, which ones are little? Maybe we only want A and D this time because we want 2 little things that we can fit in, and C is going to take more than all 4 of them combined. So we want to be able to make those decisions based a little bit on sizing. So that's a really important aspect of the plan, evolving the plan. But you had a second point to your question that I've now spaced on. I'm sorry.
Oh, I spaced on it too. That's okay.
He was saying about management's imposing it.
Oh, yeah. So commitment. So one of the things that's always stated, and you see cartoons and funny pictures about it, is that, oh, they asked us for estimates, and then the next thing you know, that was the commitment, right? And so, yeah, that's a classic example of an abuse of estimates on the one hand. You don't want to just do that willy-nilly. Like, how much time is that going to take you? Okay, that's when it's due. You know, that's obviously an egregious example of setting a commitment without that kind of back and forth talk, etc. But on the other hand, deadlines and commitments need to be a reality. There are positive aspects to deadlines and commitments in general. To have those in an organization, they lead to, in my mind, personal commitment, engagement, and high performance. You want them to be reasonable, you want them to be achievable, but you want them to be out there and known and transparent. And if you don't have them, you lose that sense of commitment, etc. And unless you deny the need for deadlines and commitments entirely, which some no estimates people do, but if you accept that those have to be out there, how else are they going to be set without some kind of form of estimate? In other words, can you imagine any plan, deadline, commitment that doesn't implicitly and hopefully explicitly involve some sense of, okay, we set this because we figured out we could make that, we could do that, we could build it. And people kind of don't realize that. They just get so focused that, oh, commitments based on estimates are a bad thing. All commitments are based on estimates. They all are.
Well, I guess if you're not making commitments, then you're no better than a weatherman that's just kind of saying, well, we think that's going to happen.
Well, you know, in my mind, that's no estimates people taken sometimes out their word. That's the implication of what they're saying. I even had a no estimates person. I put this up in the presentations I give on this, where he said, well, I can commit for tomorrow, maybe the day after, on anything, but after that, just can't. And the other thing that I point out that people, often developers, don't have visibility to is, what does that do to the IT reputation when you start having a bunch of people who talk that way? You know, what does that do when you're in the meeting and you say, well, I don't know when the software will be ready. We can't possibly commit past the day after tomorrow. Yeah, that's a pretty negative thing.
I've seen it work really well where a team will be involved in Scrum or something like that. They're responsible for this 2 weeks, and then you have project management on top of that that's talking about your longer-term milestones and your goals, the release that these sprints are rolling up to. I've seen those working hand in hand pretty well, but that's more of a mature standpoint.
Yeah, and it involves, you know, different organizations have different levels of complexity, different levels of structure and the like. But in the end, someone's figuring out, can we deliver this in the time frame needed?
But do you think, Peter, that maybe it's because it's been taken to the extreme? Like, I always look at examples like during World War II, what the United States was able to build as far as military presence, the massive aircraft carriers and the tanks and the planes, all, you know, within a 2-year period. We have people who can't even put a project plan together within 2 years now on software, right? So the extreme of trying to plan every little thing and estimate and then measure may have caused people to slow down, and they look at the startups and say, well, the startups do it. They get it done, right?
Right. So, but I guess my reaction to that is that, yeah, you know, it's a straw man to talk about examples where things have been overplanned to the gnat's eyelash. I've certainly seen that. I work with entities that have binders and binders of documents up front, you know, and it's not very useful, it's not very helpful, and it doesn't, you know, usually achieve the success that they needed in the time that they needed either. That said, it's a straw man. We don't have to do that. We don't have to reject all estimates simply because some people have taken them to unviable extremes.
Fair enough, yeah.
It's interesting, though, to see...
The analogy I always use is hospitals, you know. You could go on, I could name any number of examples where people have gotten horrible infections at hospitals and died and, you know, been very sickly because, you know, hospitals are a breeding ground for infections, aren't they? We need to eliminate hospitals. That's kind of the thinking.
It's interesting, though, to see how it differs even within the startup-style companies. I mean, you look at Google and their homepage, there's no commitments there. There's no expectation or release numbers or anything like that. And yet Android itself has very specific release numbers that are named after, you know, ice cream sandwiches and the like. So even these types of companies have different approaches, it seems, in terms of commitments.
Well, yeah, and, you know, there's a lot that's happening behind the scenes. You know, the duck flapping hard under the water, and you can't tell from above the water that it's, you know, doing anything necessarily. You know, that's a common, you know, one no estimates person wrote an article that says, well, Apple doesn't release its you know, product plans. That proves no estimates, you know, is a valid approach. Well, behind the scenes, you really think that there are no estimates or no plans at Apple for how they're developing products? Not at Apple, I don't know.
Maybe a little bit less now that Steve Jobs isn't around.
Maybe it's just a communications thing, right? Maybe it's kind of like SLAs. I'm a big no SLAs person, right? Because someone defines, well, you have to respond or repair this system within 4 hours. It's like, how would you even know that you could commit to that? How could you even begin to? Yeah, that's reasonable.
It depends how much money you have too. I mean,
well, yeah. It's communication, right? That's what I'm saying. It's communication. Who are you trying to communicate to? Who are you trying to make feel comfortable, I guess.
Right. But you know, taking that to an extreme, you know, I hear you, and I've been in operations. I hear both sides of that, you know, that argument very equally well. You know, think about it. Go to a customer and say, we're not going to tell you. We have no idea if something goes down. We have no idea when you're going to be back up. Yeah, right. Imagine how that lands, you know, in their ears. So, you know, SLAs exist in some ways to start that communication. I've been in any number of situations where there's been a 4-hour SLA and something happens that is truly outside the realm of any expectations, and there's ongoing dialogue. And it isn't just handled via, well, you didn't meet the SLA, you know, you owe us a penalty, etc. There's ongoing dialogue, and it's part of the whole consumer or the customer business collaboration.
Yeah, you have to have some way to improve.
Yeah, well, that goes back to my earlier point about, you know, if you have an SLA that's a 4-hour breach will cost you $1 million, then the organization is going to be committed to make sure the resources and the processes and the people are not haphazardly changing things or thinking about quality or redundancy in the proper ways, right? And so there's a level of commitment to those expectations and estimates and planning that need to be there. So it's
So I guess from your language there, I would submit that you're probably not really a no SLA guy.
No, I'm not I call it SLT. I call them service level targets.
Yeah, there you go. Well, you know what's interesting about that whole angle?
Yeah.
Is that the no estimates people insist now that they don't really mean no estimates. They mean estimates some of the time, although they never really say why, when. But it's one of those things of you can be out against something without saying we're going to eliminate it entirely.
All right, well, that's an interesting topic. I love it. Peter says no estimates. Hooper, what do you say? No estimates, yes or no?
Yeah, well, obviously you need to run a business based on planning and estimates. I think that it just comes across to commitments. You know, let's commit to the things that matter, right? Estimate where it makes sense. If you think you're going to give best effort, then go for best effort, and we'll figure it out as we go.
There you go.
I like the sentiment behind it, but definitely need some control around it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Peter, for joining us today. This is Hacking Business Technology. Thanks, Hooper.
Thanks, Mark.
See you guys next time.
Glad to be here. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.